Today we will take a little closer look at the concept of sense in being and time, which is very important. This might be the point where Heidegger sort of digress from all other philosophers, as long as I am known, as long as the philosophers I know about. The concept of sense in Science-Frage, University of Notre Dame, Tarek R Dika. The novelty of Heidegger's formulation of the Science-Frage in being and time consists not in its orientation towards the sense of being in general, but rather in the way in which he understands the Science-Frage and the path he lays out in order to answer it. Heidegger's principal thesis in Being in Time is that time constitutes the horizon for any understanding whatsoever of being, and therefore time effectively constitutes the sense of being in general, Sinn von Sein überhaupt. This means that time organizes the manifold senses of being in both its categorical and existential determinations, by referring them back to a general or focal sense. Before one examines Heidegger's thesis that time constitutes the sense of being, however, it is important to underline the following points. It does not go without saying that the question of being should be framed in terms of the concept of sense. Even after Heidegger defines the concept of sense as an existential in being and time, the decision to formulate the Science-Frage in terms of the concept of sense conceals a number of suppositions. The most important being the supposition that the manifold senses of being can be organized around or referred back to a focal sense. This supposition does not depend on the thesis that the sense of being turns out to be constituted by time. The entire problem of the sense of being and the possibility of a science devoted to this problem arises from the elementary fact that the sense of being is manifold. Being has many different senses. It is not initially clear whether these senses can be organized around a focal sense. In nearly all of his courses, both before and immediately after Being and Time, Heidegger continually reminds his readers and students that being is a polachos legomenon. He introduces the Science-Frage by referring to the universally recognized, even pre-philosophically available fact that being has many senses, i.e. that the understanding of being which constitute Dasein in its being is as diverse and differentiated as the kinds of being that there are. Furthermore, he consistently restricts the multiplicity of the senses of being to the level of beings alone. It is being in the diversity that differentiate the sense of being and distribute it over the whole territory of beings. Nevertheless, for Heidegger, the diversity of the senses of being is never so radical as to affect the sense of being in general. The sense of being, once determined, can account for the many senses of being, for however different these senses may be, both from one another and from being itself, the focal sense of being does not evaporate in mere equivocation. Being is not equivocal, and only insofar as it is not equivocal can the question regarding its sense first arise. And yet being is not univocal either. It does not always and everywhere have the same sense. Hence the problem: if being is neither equivocal nor univocal in its sense, but rather has an Aristotelian unity of analogy, as Heidegger put it in Being and Time. What does that mean, and how can the sense of being organize its manifold senses? The manner in which Heidegger formulates the Seinsfrage as a question about the relation between the focal sense of being and the many senses of being in no way depends on any substantive phenomenological thesis. It is entirely Aristotelian and can be formulated without reference to the phenomenological method or phenomenological concepts. Indeed, Heidegger sets out to demonstrate why ontology is only possible as a phenomenology in being and time. He sets out to demonstrate why the Seinsfrage can only be raised and answered by means of phenomenology. The manner in which Heidegger formulates the Seinsfrage also does not depend on any thesis about the correlation between being and time. That time constitutes the horizon for any understanding of being, whatever is Heidegger's answers to the Seinsfrage, and forms no part of the formulation of the Seinsfrage, which can and has throughout the history of metaphysics been raised without any explicit reference whatever to the correlation between being and time. The correlation between being and time as the explicit and privileged object of ontological inquiry is peculiar to Heidegger's own project in Being and Time. Thus, I will postpone discussing the correlation between being and time until paragraph 3 in order to focus first on how the concept of sense operates in Heidegger's formulation of the Seinsfrage in Being and Time. My hypothesis in paragraph 3 will be that Heidegger's interpretation of time, or the way in which he understands the relation between being and time, is deeply determined by the concept of sense he employs in his formulation of the Seinsfrage. In paragraph 2, I will argue that Heidegger's strategy for motivating the Seinsfrage consistently failed to establish the thesis that being has a focal sense that can be the object of ontological inquiry. In paragraph 4, I will conclude by suggesting, but only suggesting, that Heidegger's thesis that time constitutes the sense of being is philosophically problematic and historically questionable. The Greeks, Aristotle, did not even unthematically understand being in terms of time in the way Heidegger suggests. Rather, I will argue they understood time in terms of motion, and motion in terms of power. Dynamis energia, in fact, Heidegger knew very well, and which he analyzed in many contexts. But which he consistently interpreted in ways that favor the priority of time, that is constant presence, over every other horizon of understanding of being. Paragraph 2. Is the sense of being given in the understanding of being? Heidegger's principal strategy for motivating the Seinsfrage and motivating the Seinsfrage has become absolutely necessary in light of its forgottenness and obscurity, is to point the fact that we already live and therefore have an understanding of being, Seinsverständnis. In Being and Time, paragraph 1, Heidegger addresses the objection that there is no need to raise the Seinsfrage, since being is of all concepts the one that is self-evident. For whenever one cognizes anything or makes an assertion, whenever one comports oneself towards entities, even towards oneself, some use is made of being. In any way of comporting oneself to entities as entities, even in any being towards entities as entities, there lies a priori an enigma. The very fact that we already live in an understanding of being, and that the sense of being is still veiled in darkness, proves that it is necessary in principle to raise this question again. From the fact that we live in or have an understanding of being, and therefore of beings in their totality. Heidegger infers that there must be a sense whose sovereignty over the many senses of being can be demonstrated. This sense remains veiled in darkness. The thesis that the sense of being is veiled in darkness depends on the thesis, 1, that there is such a sense, 2, that the many senses of being somehow veil its focal sense. But has Heidegger actually demonstrated that the understanding of being depends on the prior givenness of the sense of being? Not at all. From the fact that Dasein lives in the understanding of being, it only follows that Dasein understand the many senses of being, not that these senses are organized around or refer back to a focal sense, which each of the many senses differentiates in its own way. In Being and Time, paragraph 2, Heidegger once more insists on the fact that Dasein's understanding of being indicate that the sense of being has already been disclosed to it, if only in a vague, average, durchschnittliche Waage manner. He first insists that we always conduct our activities in an understanding of being. Out of this understanding arises both the explicit question of the sense of being and the tendency that leads us towards its conception. We do not know what being means, but even if we ask, what is being, we keep within an understanding of the is, though we are unable to fix conceptually what that is signifies. We do not even know the horizon in terms of which that meaning is to be grasped and fixed. But this vague average understanding of being is still a fact. Here Heidegger claims that the question of the sense of being merely renders explicit the understanding of being itself. The Seinsfrage is simply what the understanding of being becomes when the latter turns towards itself and raises questions about its content and possibility in order to discover the sense of being that underlies and determines it. The sense of being, i.e. the Erfragte, the third and most important part of the formal structure of the question of being, unassumingly falls out of the understanding of being when the latter adopts the comportment, verhalten, of ontological inquiry. Later in paragraph 2, Heidegger once more insists on the givenness of the sense of being in the understanding of being. Everything we talk about, everything we have in view, everything towards which we comport ourselves in any way is being. What we are is being, and so is how we are. Being lies in the fact that something is, and in its being as it is. In reality, in presence at hand, in substance, in subsistence, in validity, in Dasein, in the Es gibt. In this passage, Heidegger has effectively enumerated many of the senses of being. He hopes to ground in the focal sense being as reality, presence at hand, as the existence in the traditional sense, existentia, or essence also in the traditional sense, essentia, Dasein, existence, truth. There is no contesting the fact that Dasein understand all of these senses of being. Nevertheless, once more, Heidegger has inferred from the fact that Dasein has an understanding of all these senses of being that there is a focal sense. Each of these senses only declines or differentiates. All of his descriptions of Dasein's understanding of being presupposes that his understanding would not be possible without the prior givenness of the conceptually obscure but nevertheless effective focal sense of being, which binds these senses to one another and so exercises ontological priority over them all. From these considerations, I draw a preliminary conclusion. The introduction to Being and Time does not conclusively demonstrate that the Seinsfrage can only be formulated as a Frage nach dem Sinn von Sein, because the only possible basis for such a thesis is not itself demonstrated, that the sense of being is given in, and so informs the understanding of being, such that the latter would not be possible without the former. The dependence of the understanding of being on the sense of being is presupposed but not demonstrated. Heidegger's descriptions of the understanding of being phenomenological yield only that Dasein understands the many senses of being, not that this understanding depends on the prior givenness of the focal sense of being. The only remaining way for Heidegger to demonstrate the thesis that the sense of being achieves givenness in, and so informs the understanding of being, is to demonstrate it, not independently of the thesis that the sense of being is constituted by time, as it should have been demonstrated, but rather precisely by reference to this thesis alone, which is not demonstrated by the end of this unfinished treatise, not even by Heidegger's own admission. I will return to this in paragraph 3. Henceforth, in order to show that being has a focal sense that determines its manifold senses, Heidegger must show that the focal sense is time, and he must show that how time organizes and distributes the many senses of being. Heidegger must demonstrate in the conclusion what he could only presuppose in the introduction. This is not a circularity charge, which Heidegger adroitly disposes of early on in the introduction by oblique reference to Plato's Menos and Aristotle's posterior analytics. Clearly, in the very general sense, in every inquiry of the object of inquiry must in some way already be given. I'm not criticizing Heidegger for claiming both that we already know what being means and claiming that we have yet to discover what being means. I am claiming that Heidegger does not demonstrate the prior givenness of the sense of being in the understanding of being. In other words, Heidegger does not satisfy the phenomenological criterion of evidence. On the contrary, he infers the prior givenness of the sense of being from what is truly and alone given. The many senses of being, of which Dasein does indeed have an understanding, this understanding is given very clearly. Heidegger's thesis that the understanding of being depends on the prior givenness of the sense of being stems from traditional Aristotelian ontology, not phenomenology. That Heidegger must demonstrate and cannot simply assume that the Seinsfrage can only be posed by distinguishing between the focal sense of being and the many senses of being is clear. His entire aim in the introduction to Being and Time is to pose the Seinsfrage and to remind his reader of what the question means, to reawaken the Seinsfrage in his readers, precisely as the question of sense. Paragraph 3. In paragraph 1 to 2, I claim that Heidegger does not successfully, i.e. phenomenologically, demonstrate that the Seinsfrage must be formulated in terms of the focal sense of being, as contrasted with the many senses of being. There is, however, a further supposition Heidegger makes in his formulation of the Seinsfrage that cannot be passed over here. That the sense of being, whatever it might be, can only be determined by reference to the horizon in terms of which beings are understood. The concept of the horizon is transcendental and denotes an a priori condition of possibility, however not in the Kantian formal sense, but rather in the phenomenological, concrete sense of a condition that can itself be exhibited in phenomenological intuition and therefore evidence. An horizon gives light to whatever appears within its limits, peras. And here what appears within its limits are beings. The thesis that sense of being can only be determined by reference to an horizon is logically independent of the thesis that the horizon is time. However closely related these two theses are to one another in a conceptual economy of being and time, so closely related that we hardly ever distinguish between them. That the sense of being must be determined in terms of a horizon only means that whatever the sense of being might be, it can only appear in the light cast by a transcendental condition. To assert that time is a horizon in which any understanding of being moves is to assert that it occupies the office of such a condition and as such enjoys priority over being as the foundation of its sense, and therefore as what enables us to fix its sense. Thus, before Heidegger has even attempted to offer an interpretation of time, he has already assigned it a definite place in ontological inquiry versus that of a condition. Furthermore, because of the equivalence between one, time as the horizon of the sense of being, and two, time as the horizon of Dasein's understanding of being. The next steps of the inquiry have been clearly delineated. It must be shown that time conditions Dasein's understanding of being. An existential analytic, therefore, becomes necessary. The concept of horizon interposes time between being and beings, such that beings understandingly appear to Dasein only insofar as they are temporally projected by Dasein via what Heidegger terms its potentiality for being. So we have being, you're not supposed to write. This is sign. Time projects out of sein, Seiendes. So from Sein, we get the projection into Seiendes. Time does that. It takes time to analyze, it takes time to sort of perceive. It's a time-dependent thing in itself. The concept of horizon interposes time between being and beings. It is the factor. It's another clue here. Such that beings understandingly appear to Dasein only insofar as they are temporally projected by Dasein via what Heidegger terms its potentiality for being. Sein können, pouvoir être. If the Seinsfrage is formulated in terms of focal, unified sense of being, which commands the totality of its many senses, and if moreover, this sense of being can only be disclosed, not via a definition of any sort, but rather as an horizon. And if finally 3, the horizon is itself defined as time, then it is only by way of Dasein's deployment of temporality in from projection that the sense of being can be disclosed. In this way of posing the Seinsfrage, time enjoys transcendental priority over being, so much that the fundamental ontology becomes irreducible to temporal science, where time is interpreted in an explicitly transcendental manner due to the form of the Seinsfrage, and more specifically the dependence of the sense of being on its own horizon. But Dasein is an entity whose sense is itself dependent on the prior givenness of the sense of being. Claude Romano has compellingly demonstrated that Heidegger's project in Being and Time and basic problems of phenomenology fails because his analysis of Dasein's temporality ultimately yields only 3 senses of being. None of which can be identified with the sense of being in general. These 3 senses are Zuhandenheit, Vorhandenheit, and Existenz. The first 2 depends on ecstasies of the present and its modification in the now, Gegenwart jetzt, and the third depends on the ecstasies of the authentic future, Zukunft. The problem is that these three ecstasies, together with the corresponding schemata, do not in any way seem to converge in or disclose a focal setting, but are rather irreducibly diverse, so much that they render the sense of being equivocal. Heidegger's interpretation of time does not establish the focal sense of being, but only mutually irreducible senses of being. To be sure, all of these senses refer to or are based on time, but they are mutually irreducible senses of different entities, and do not disclose a focal sense that encompasses them all. I agree with Romano's interpretation, which further confirms not only that Heidegger does not demonstrate in the introduction to Being in Time that the sense of being is given in and determines the understanding. Determines the understanding of being, and so can become an object of ontological inquiry, but also that he has not demonstrated this by the end of Being in Time and Basic Problems of Phenomenology, which contains a new elaboration of Division 3 of Part 1 of Being in Time, where Heidegger intended to finally disclose the sense of being in light of the horizon of time. Heidegger's recognition of this failure led him to realize that his formulation of the Seinsfrage stemmed not from the Sache selbst, but rather from one aspect of the history in ontology that survived the otherwise radical destruction he carries out in Being in Time. The formulation of the Seinsfrage as a question about the sense of being and time, the sense of being, to which all other senses can be referred, and in which they find their unitary ground. In the 1930s, Heidegger will abandon the project of trying to account for the sense of being by way of time. He will abandon the concept of sense in his formulation of the Seinsfrage. In the Kehre, he will focus on the co-belonging of being and time in the Ereignis, without prioritizing one over the other, according to a decidedly post-transcendental Fragestellung hinting in the direction of a phenomenology of givenness. Paragraph 4. Being, time and power. Instead of following Heidegger down the path of Ereignis, however, I would like to briefly pursue the suggestion I made in paragraph 1. I have already explained why Heidegger's thesis in Being in Time, that time constitutes the sense of being, is philosophically problematic. I would now like to explain why it is also historically problematic. The Greeks, Aristotle, I suggest, did not understand being in terms of time in the way Heidegger suggests. Rather, they understood time in terms of motion, and motion in terms of power. A fact that Heidegger knew very well, and which he analyzed in many contexts, but which he consistently interpreted in ways that favor the priority of time, constant presence, over every other horizon of the understanding of being. Why did Heidegger insist on the primacy of time as the unthematized foundation of ontological reflection in the West since Aristotle? If not earlier, in the Heidegger's text, it is clear that the historical thesis rests on his interpretation of the basic categories of Aristotelian ontology. The basic thesis running through all of Heidegger's interpretation of Aristotle is that the fundamental concepts of Aristotelian ontology are only intelligible in light of time, and more specifically, the privilege Aristotle gives to the constant presence in his interpretation of being. He frequently contends that Aristotle, together with the subsequent history of ontology up to Hegel, failed for essential reasons to fully appreciate the dependence of being on time, and so could not pose the Seinsfrage in the way in which he felt it had to be posed. Versus in terms of the relation between being and time, Heidegger's presentation of these theses is extremely abbreviated in Being and Time, but it can be found in a more elaborated form in the text written both before and after. One of the clearest formulations can be found on the essence of human freedom, where Heidegger examines the concepts of ousia, parousia, eidos, energia, and finally aletheia. He interprets all of these Aristotelian concepts in terms of time, and more importantly in terms of constant present. And he regards his temporary interpretation of Aristotelian concepts as evidence for his own thesis that being has always been understood in terms of time, and even as perhaps, especially when the relation between being and time is not explicitly stated as such, or even remotely understood. It is important to remember that Heidegger does not simply regard his interpretation of Aristotle as a merely external confirmation of an independently phenomenologically verifiable thesis about the relation between being and time. On the contrary, as he himself explicitly asserts, if this interpretation of being as constant presence, beständige Anwesenheit, is not correct, there can be no basis for unfolding a connection between being and time. As demanded by the fundamental question. Nevertheless, things are not so clear. Heidegger wavers immediately after he continues. Yet although Greek metaphysics as such, together with the subsequent tradition of Western metaphysics, is of great significance for our problem, its implications do not extend this far. For even if for some reason or other our interpretation of Greek ontology could not be carried through, what we have asserted as the fundamental orientation of the understanding of being could be exhibited from our own immediate comportment towards beings. As will be shown, we humans must understand beings in terms of time. Here Heidegger insists on the fundamental exteriority of any historical investigation vis-à-vis the correlation between being and time, which can, he claims, always be demonstrated independently by reference to the understanding of being, and so remain secure from history, should any anomaly in the history of being creep in and destabilize the required correlation between being and time Heidegger demands. Clearly Heidegger is worried about the possibility that his analysis might not yield the required conclusion, so that the history of ontology, beginning with the Greeks, has always understood beings in terms of time. But he is too subtle. Excuse me. But he is too subtle to simply reverse his earlier statement, for he adds yet another fold. However, the history of metaphysics provides us with more than just examples. History offers us more than a picture of earlier and superseded stages of thought. If we try to grasp the Greek concept of being, this is not a matter of acquiring external historical knowledge, for it helps us show that the Greek concept of being has determined the history of ontology up to Hegel in a non-arbitrary way. How should we interpret Heidegger's hesitations? He is not seeking in history a series of examples. Indeed, Dasein's understanding of being must always live itself out in terms of time, and the interpretation of historical text must always confirm this. Any historical exception is no longer a mere exception, but rather constitutes an objection to the philosophical thesis that Dasein always understands beings in terms of time. In other words, Dasein's Seinsverständnis places constraints on the interpretation of being historical Dasein has produced from the Greeks to the present. Suppose then that Heidegger were to demonstrate what we now know he cannot, versus that the focal sense of being is constituted in the horizon of time, and that this sense organizes all other possible senses of being. What would happen if Heidegger's interpretation of Aristotle were to turn out not to confirm the thesis that beings is always interpreted in terms of time? Would we say that this is a mere anomaly, an exception that proves the rule? Not at all. We would say that such a disconfirmation should be a priori impossible, given the kind of being that Dasein is, and the fact that the history of ontology is but the history of various attempts to articulate what its understanding of being consists in. The trace of time as the foundation of the sense of being must leave its mark in every understanding of being, from the most ancient to the most contemporary, from the most vulgar to the most elevated. This trace can never be fully erased, however buried it might be. Significantly, Heidegger's hesitations about the importance of history of ontology in confirming his thesis that being has always been interpreted in terms of time occur immediately after this section of the course devoted to the concept of energia. Regarding the latter, he writes, in summary, we can say that the Aristotelian concept for the actuality of the actual, i.e. the concept of energia, as well as the latter concept of actualitas, determined by this, does not initially confirm our thesis of constant presence as the fundamental meaning of being in Greek philosophy. Why? This is not immediately clear. On the contrary, everything in Heidegger's text up to this point seemed to suggest that his interpretation of energia does confirm the thesis that constant presence is the fundamental meaning of being in Aristotle. After all, Aristotle himself, as Heidegger interprets him, correlates dynamis to apousia, energia to parousia in the conceptual economy of metabole, which is the essence of physis and which Heidegger's regards as fundamental to Aristotle's concept of ousia. Looks like this. Metabole, apousia, parousia, dynamis, energia. Why then, if energia belongs to parousia, can be seen here, if energia belongs to parousia, can there be any risk of disconfirmation in Heidegger's fundamental thesis that being has always been interpreted in terms of time? Here I can only risk the following hypothesis because the play of dynamis and energia grounds the play of apousia and parousia, i.e. of ousia as defined by these two terms, rather than the other way around. This is mighty interesting, I might say. And this is because dynamis and energia are more fundamental since they ground time itself. Time is but the measure of change, and the play of dynamis and energia are the sources of all change in physics. Time reveals itself as a secondary derivative by comparison to dynamis and energia, for these do not depend on time, rather time depends on them. The value of presence in Aristotle is but the value of a fully manifested power in energia. No manifest power, no presence. Energia does not occur in the present. It is itself the source of any and all presencing. The word energia denotes the manifestation of a dynamis, of an ability to be. In short, energia is the manifestation of a sein können, which is also the origin of Dasein's temporality. Dasein does not project into a future that is already there, but rather in projecting its own potentiality for being, is the future. Even in being and time, power has the priority over time, since time arises directly from Dasein's ability to be. Heidegger's reduction of energia to parousia in On the Essence of Human Freedom is a strategic decision made in the interest of preserving the correlation between being and time. For in truth, parousia is reducible to energia. But if this is so, then we must raise questions about Heidegger's temporal interpretation of the fundamental concepts of Aristotelian ontology, and perhaps invert the order of priority. We put dynamis here. Oh, yeah, parousia. Or then apousia will be here instead. The reversal. For in truth, parousia is reducible to energia. But if this is so, we must raise questions about Heidegger's temporal interpretation of the fundamental concepts of Aristotelian ontology, and perhaps invert the order of priority, as we've done here. To conclude, I have defended these two theses, one historical and one philosophical, although the distinction between them cannot be rigorously maintained in this context. The philosophical thesis is twofold. First, Heidegger demonstrates neither that the sense of being is given in the understanding of being in the introduction of being and time, nor that time constitutes the horizon of the sense of being by the end of being and time, and also in basic problems of phenomenology. Second, power determines Heidegger's own interpretation of the understanding of being, even in being in time itself. Dasein always understands itself in terms of its ownmost ability to be. And time is nothing over above the ability to be in all of the various ways, authentic and inauthentic, in which it can be modelized. The historical thesis is that Aristotle did not interpret beings in terms of time. Ousia is reducible to energia, as the manifestation of dynamis and time, despite its importance, is secondary. The concept of the phenomenon in Aristotle, and perhaps beyond, is essentially the concept of expressed power. These two theses reorient the concept of phenomena and the question of being in different direction towards the concept of power and away from the concept of time. It's taking a very modern view, thinking that something can be more fundamental than time, and maybe because how they said certain things in Greek time, used energia instead of time, dynamis instead of time, he thought that those were more fundamental. He is looking with modern eyes at a Greek saying, and that is so wrong. Time is fundamental. Time is what makes possible to have dynamis and energia, to looking for two other things as more fundamental, and then also accusing Heidegger of trying to build a watertight ship that can't be sunk, because otherwise there will be some corrosion in his theory, his idea. I think that is patently wrong. And it glads me to see how difficult it is to understand Heidegger, because the Seinsfrage is so unusual. So what can you do when you start to look into Heidegger? You don't realize how close time and being are connected, and that you need to think two things at the same time. And I would say we are not used to think two things at the same time, and we need to train that to happen. Otherwise an understanding won't come. There are very few areas where we need to have simultaneous thinking. I don't talk about simultaneous doing, I talk about simultaneous thinking. And we are not built for that in the Western modern world, because we constantly exclude. We cannot encompass. we are jumping between contradictions, simple contradictions like past and now and past. That was in the past, this is in the now, and thereby chopping everything up. And that makes it harder to be able to think broader and have two lines of thinking. I mean, not if somebody asks you, can you think about that, and you say yes, no. I mean literally have two lines of thinking, which can be shown on a functional MRI, and it can be trained, but it is highly unusual. And I think this is what Heidegger is pointing to, a possibility to see how, when we approach Sein, we project with time to have Seiendes. This is the process. So far, so correct. How that work will be an area for another lecture. It would be a place for another lecture. Now this so far, I do not agree with the writer of the article in the IMPR journal, Tarek R Dika. Although he is from the University of Notre Dame, it is simply not true. But it's still very interesting, goes to show how very, very difficult this is to understand. And somebody who's written about this unusual question that Heidegger posed, which is central, it is his tenet, but it's so unusual, it's so indistinct for us with our cut short contradictions that we will miss it. His name, he has a Swedish name, Daniel Söderblom, but he's not Swedish, but of course of Swedish ancestry. I will get back to him, and I say thank you very much. It was a sheer pleasure. Have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye, or pleasant night.